which is on foreign direct investment in the United States, its benefits, suspicions, risks, etc. This is the flip side of the coin we talked about before, the outward FDI by U.S. firms. This is now the inward FDI to the United States by foreign-based companies. Also controversial, also raises lots of issues. Some of them are similar on the economic side, some are quite different in terms of national security and other considerations. And we're trying in this comprehensive strategy here at the Institute to present both sides of the coin. We've got 3 presentations on this part of the picture today on the inward FDI side. The first, again, will be Lindsay Oldensky, who will lay out the economics of the inward FDI, particularly their impacts on the U.S. economy. I already introduced her. I don't have to do that again. Then Ted Moran, who helped frame the overall project, you've already heard from him briefly, will talk about the particularly important and sensitive part of the inward FDI equation, the China question. Is Chinese inward investment different? Should it be viewed differently by U.S. policy? Should there be particular approaches geared to it? This is in some degree, of course, reminiscent of the question raised about Japanese FDI 20 and 30 years ago. The Institute did extensive work on that at the time. We're trying to replicate that now with our work on Chinese inward FDI to see whether there are justifications in the complaints about that particular phenomenon. I didn't really introduce Ted properly before, partly because almost all of you know him. He's been associated with us here at the Institute since 1998 and done a series of studies for us, particularly on inward FDI, the CFIUS process, and how U.S. Policy responses should be fashioned. He was the founder of the Landegger Program in International Business Diplomacy at Georgetown. He's now the Marcus Wallenberg Chair at the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown. Since 2007, very directly related to the topic today, he has served as an associate to the National Intelligence Council on international business issues, advising them on the CFIUS process, the kinds of things we are talking about today. Ted has published extensively on FDI, going back to the book that he and I co-authored, as I said, almost 40 years ago. Then, as our discussant, we're delighted to have Mike Wessel. Mike has run his own public affairs consulting group since 2006, after serving for over 20 years as literally the right-hand man to Dick Gephardt when he was the House Democratic leader, for whom Mike was general counsel, chief strategist, advisor, and negotiator for many years, including as the principal aide to the Ways and Means Committee on numerous tax, trade, policy initiatives, and was involved in all the major trade and tax pieces of legislation for that extensive period when he was on the Hill. He was involved in Congressman Gephardt's presidential campaign in '88, involved in the Clinton-Gore campaign in '92, and in fact the Kerry campaign most recently in 2004. So Mike brings an enormous amount of experience on the firing line, particularly in the Congress and the body politic on these highly sensitive and political issues. We look forward to his comments after hearing from Lindsay on the economics, Ted on the national security. Lindsay.
All right, well, thank you again, Fred. So, we just heard about U.S. firms investing outwardly and all the controversies surrounding that topic. So now I'll talk about inward foreign direct investment by foreign firms in the U.S., which is also surrounded by its own controversies. And, as Fred mentioned, this was with a lot of concerns when Japanese investment was on the rise in, the 1980s, 1990s. And most of those fears and those, sort of doomsday scenarios just didn't come to play. But we're still hearing the same concerns now with the rise of foreign direct investment by Chinese firms. So we're going to look at, both inward foreign direct investment in general, and then specifically what are the implications of FDI in the US by Chinese firms. So in the first panel, we talked about outward FDI flows, and the United States is by far the largest source of outward foreign direct investment in the world, followed by Germany, France, Hong Kong, and China. So China's up there in the top 5. As anyone of you who have thought about this before knows those official numbers on China's outward FDI flows are almost certainly underestimates. A number of investments from China are routed through Hong Kong and other areas. So likely, some of that Hong Kong bar should actually be shifted over to the China column. But in either case, it's still not going to be anywhere close to the volume of outward FDI flows by the US. And then if you look at inward FDI flows, the United States, once again, also the largest host country, receives the most inward FDI flows. The US is a net outward investor, but we still receive the largest inward FDI flows, and that's about twice as much as China received in the year 2010. But even though the US and China are both top source countries and destination countries on their own, if you look at the breakdown of foreign direct investment within the US, China is way down at the end. It's the third to last one there. I don't think my laser pointer is working here, but China's number 18 there. Most of the foreign direct investment in the US comes from other rich countries. It comes from Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, countries like that. And so, it's maybe surprising that given how much outward investment China does, so little of it ends up in the US. And of all the FDI that the US receives, so little of it actually comes from China. And, it's been this way over time. So if you look at China's outward FDI stock, it's only about 1.5% of it has been in the US. And yes, China's FDI in the US has been increasing quite a bit. Our Peterson colleague Dan Rosen has very up-to-date numbers, is constantly showing the increases in billions of dollars per year, but China's FDI has been increasing everywhere, and so the US share has remained relatively constant. So is this a good thing? Is it good that there's not that much investment by China in the US, or are there opportunities for positive impacts, for positive relationships that could arise if there was a greater amount of Chinese foreign direct investment in the US? So that's what we want to look at. We want to, once again, sort of get past the debate and just look at the numbers and just see what does this investment look like? What are these firms doing in the US? So first of all, this is numbers for all foreign-owned firms in the US. This is from 2009. So this is wages. This is total compensation. So it includes benefits as well as wages. And the average per worker for US multinationals, as we know, is higher than it is for the average US firm, right? Multinationals are more productive. They pay higher wages. They're generally sort of better sources of kind of good jobs than non-multinationals. But what doesn't get talked about as much is that foreign firms located in the US pay even higher wages than the highest wage-paying US firms in the US. So this is very clear, no matter how you slice the data, what years you look at, this is a very, very clear trend. And if you look at research and development, foreign-owned firms are doing, not quite as much R&D in the U.S. as U.S. multinationals are doing in the U.S. We look at it as a share of value added. So of the value they add in the U.S., how much of that is due to R&D versus, manufacturing or something else. They're still doing a lot more R&D than, the average U.S. purely domestic non-multinational firm, right? But, as I said, well, most of the FDI in the US is coming from rich countries. If it's coming from Switzerland or Germany or the UK, maybe it's something about those firms from those countries that are leading to this. So we also look at what Chinese firms are doing in the US. And we find that Chinese firms are actually paying higher average wages to their workers in the US than are even the other foreign firms. And they're investing more in R&D in the U.S. per firm. And this is maybe this seems surprising, but if you think about what these firms are doing, it's not quite as surprising, right? Why is any firm investing in the U.S., and in particular, why is a Chinese multinational firm investing in the U.S.? I mean, I don't know, maybe espionage. I don't. Ted will address that. But more likely, what they're doing is coming in order to, not to chase low wages, They're not here for, you know, the abundant supply of really cheap labor. They're here for the things that the US does the best and that US workers do the best. And this is research and development, this is management, these are the more high-skilled activities. And you know, these, in addition to the skill level, there's also the intellectual property protection that's much, much higher in the US than in China and in other places. And you know, beyond that, even US standards, US quality levels, you know, you see a number of reasons that firms are coming here that aren't based on cost reduction on the lower end. They're based on sort of skill acquisition on the higher end. And then, you know, so yes, with the higher wages, it's not necessarily paying higher wages for the same jobs or for the same position at a foreign-owned firm or a Chinese-owned firm relative to that same position at a US-owned firm. It's the types of positions, it's a composition effect, the types of work that they're doing here. And then second, when you think about which firms are investing in the US, well, foreign direct investment is costly. There's, you know, a lot of these, whether you go through greenfield and you're, you know, opening a new plant, whether you're acquiring an existing firm, this is extremely costly. It's also costly in terms of information, time, know-how, you know, navigating 50 states, different tax codes, different labor laws. All of these things are extremely costly, and it's only the most productive of these foreign firms that are able to incur these costs and that are able to invest in the US. And so we see, you know, not only kind of this composition effect in terms of what types of jobs they're locating here, but also in terms of which firms are actually able to cross the ocean and make these investments in the US. So, you know, if you're thinking about that, I mentioned some sort of static examples, the wages that are paid by the different firms, but if they really are, you know, doing R&D and investing in productivity, and if it's the most productive firms that are doing this, then we might expect there to be some more dynamic effects just beyond these static effects of, you know, sort of one-time creating a job, paying a wage. And so what we do in this study, one of the things we do in this study is to look for spillover effects of multinational investment. So there's a lot of research has been done in the area of multinational spillover effects. So the basic idea is a multinational firm opens up a plant in another country. They bring with them know-how, they bring with them expertise, they bring with them new production techniques, and these new techniques, these new ideas spill over to the local firms and make local firms more productive. And this can happen in a number of different ways. It can happen horizontally if you've got two firms in the same industry and they're just watching each other, observing each other. Workers leave one firm to move to another. They take with them what they've learned at their previous firm, which might have been foreign owned, even just purely competitive effects. But they can also happen, you know, when firms are dealing with suppliers, and, you know, a foreign firm might demand a different specification, might share different types of plans with their suppliers that, you know, then sort of trickle down to the rest of the economy and have these effects that affect the domestic firms as well. And a number of papers have been written on this, primarily looking at the effect on developing countries. But what we do here is look at the effect on the US, first of aggregate FDI from anywhere in the world, and then more specifically, whether those effects actually can occur from emerging market countries investing in a country like the US. So what we do here, we again use the very detailed firm level data from the BEA. We also use data on domestic firms from the CompuStat database. These are the firms we're going to look for effects on. Are they made more productive when this inward foreign direct investment comes into their industries? You know, we're very careful in the way we compute total factor productivity. We allow for the fact that firms enter and exit, the fact that, you know, productivity and these factors that they're using are decided jointly. They're not independent. So we control for these things, as well as, you know, other things that we know are going to affect productivity. And we find very clear effects of positive spillovers. This is just in the aggregate first. So this is FDI from everywhere. And what we find is that in the first year, a 1 percentage point increase in foreign direct investment is associated with a 0.8% increase in productivity of the firms in the industry where the foreign direct investment increased. And in the second year, after there's been more time for these spillover effects to take place, 1 percentage point increase in FDI is then associated with a 2.8% increase in productivity of domestic firms. So this is huge, right? If you add them together, this is a 3.6% bump in productivity. So if you look over the time period of our sample, which was 1987 through 2007, the share of US workers at foreign-owned firms, that's what we're using as our measure of inward FDI, grew from 3.8 to 4.6%. So that's a 0.8% increase, right? And so, if a 1% increase implies in FDI implies a 3.6% increase in productivity, then this 0.8 that we observed accounts for about a 3% increase in productivity of domestic firms over the 20-year period, right? So 3% increase in productivity due to inward FDI over 20 years, is that big? Is that small? Well, if you consider how much US total factor productivity grew in that period, it grew by about 25%. So that 3% of the 25% is non-trivial. That's more than 10%. That's about 12% of the TFP growth over those 2 decades that we attribute to these positive effects from the presence of foreign multinationals in the US. So it's quite a big result. And so this is aggregate FDI. We also asked the question, what is driving this? This is just like I said, most of the foreign direct investment in the US is coming from European countries, Japan, Canada, places like that. So next we separate out the high-income countries from the emerging market and low-income countries to see if there's still an effect there. And the result is, yes, this is mostly driven by FDI from Europe and Japan and those high-income countries, but we still do see an effect when emerging market firms invest in the US. There's a small negative impact during the first year, but after 2 years, that effect becomes positive and actually has a positive impact on productivity of domestic firms resulting from this inward FDI, even from emerging market firms. So in conclusion, we looking just at the descriptive statistics, we see that foreign firms pay higher wages and perform more R&D in the US than the average US firm. And we also find evidence that the existence of these firms is not just job creation in a static sense, but also that they have more long-term, more lasting productivity effects on the local market.
Well, now, for those of you who have had enough pure economics, we're going to shift to a different kind of analysis and look at national security threats from foreign acquisitions of U.S. firms, and try to figure out when do foreign acquisitions of indigenous companies pose a genuine national security threat? Focus on the genuine. What do we mean by that? We are drawing on a 3 threats framework for which the Peterson Institute has become known. I've done some of this, but some of you will go back to work by Monty Graham and by David Marchik, so that we looked at U.S. experience with foreign acquisitions, but now we have put it in a comparative perspective, European perspective, and indeed in the next panel I'm going to try and generalize about how this could be applied. This perspective could be applied to all OECD countries, indeed all countries around the world. The first kind of threat is denial or manipulation of access. This came out of the period of Japanese expansion in the semiconductor industry. Might they withhold semiconductors? We now have contemporary examples. Might China take over US or Canadian or Australian rare earths mines and then try and manipulate provision of rare earths? I'm going to give examples of this. The second, completely different kind of threat is leakage of sensitive technology or know-how that could be used in a way that would be detrimental to US interests. And I have to tell you, you can think of a Russian or a Chinese firm taking over sensitive technology, but most of the investigations and cases that CFIUS deals with are actually, French firms and Israeli firms that fear that there is going to be some leakage of sensitive technology that might get into hands where the United States does not want it. And then the third separate kind of threat is infiltration, espionage, and disruption. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time on that. Okay, so let me give you an example of how we think the analysis of genuine national security threats should be carried out. An example is a Russian oligarch wanted to buy Oregon steel. Did this constitute a national security threat? And I'm asking you, how do we think about this rigorously? Well, you start with criticality or crucialness. Steel is a major component, more than 4,000 kinds of military equipment, and steel, of course, is a critical component of much of the civilian economy. So, yes, steel is critical. I warn you, most kind of analysis stops here. Is energy critical? Is oil critical? Yes, they just get to the critical and then they say, oh my God, well, I'm now sounding like my daughter. Oh my God, we got to keep them out of steel or we got to keep them out of energy. But this is only the first step. Critical or crucial is defined as the cost of doing without or switching to an alternative. And this is the rigorous. For there to be a credible likelihood that a good or service can be withheld, the industry must be tightly concentrated, number of close substitutes limited, and switching costs high. So you have to take a second level of analysis to see if there might be a genuine national security threat. Well, I'll go back to the Oregon steel. It was a small operation, run-of-the-mill structural steel, not something very high or sensitive. So even though you say, yes, steel is crucial, you come to the idea that there's no credible way that this could be manipulated or delayed, or if it did, you just switch to an alternative supplier. So that is the analytical process. Now, let's go to the second threat, leakage of sensitive technology or know-how. And the example I want us to think through is Lenovo's acquisition of IBM's PC business. Could this pose some kind of a national security threat? Well, looking at threat 1, which is the manipulation or denial, or threat 2, leakage of sensitive technology, I look at Steve, I look at others. I mean, PCs have been commoditized. There are many different alternatives. You can switch from one to another. So once again, when you can say, are computers crucial? But when you say, is there a leakage of a technology that you want to maintain, or you don't want to be dependent upon a supplier, there's so many alternatives and the switching costs are so low that this is not a credible threat. Third, and this is the last category, infiltration, espionage, and disruption. The big turning point case that illustrated this was the Dubai Ports case, and concerned that foreign acquisition of ports might find a setting that the new owner was less vigilant or might be complicit in facilitating surveillance or sabotage. Now, the CFIUS process in the United States can also set up a specific remedy, which in fact it did in the case of Dubai Ports, so that the Dubai Port said that for each U.S. port, it would be run entirely by Americans, that there would be security checks of the Americans, that you would have a special reporting link with Homeland Security and with immigration. So in fact, even though this became a cause célèbre, it was pretty well buttoned up so that it didn't look like, quote, the Arabs, or could use this as a means of infiltration. Now, this three threats framework, I am arguing, we are arguing, provides a rigorous way to separate credible from implausible national security threats. If we had more time, I mean, we could go through CNOOC's acquisition of energy, again, very small, just, it got to be a big cause, but there was no credible way that you could think that this was going to affect U.S. security. And so I think that the framework laid out here provides a way of rigorously separating out whether or not there might be. Maybe I should give you a case. If a Chinese firm were to acquire Molycorp, which is the only producer in the United States of rare earths, or were to acquire Canadian or Australian producers of rare earths, given the fact that they have an 80% hold over the market, and they have in fact manipulated the provision of rare earths vis-a-vis Japan, I think, so I'm telling you, there are cases that I think would be a plausible national security threat. So I've given you a lot that are implausible, but I think by the same criteria you can come up with some that can. Now, note what I'm saying. For threats 1 and 2, the threat is credible only, I repeat, if the industry is tightly concentrated, alternatives are few, and switching costs are high. So it is that kind of analysis that tells you if something that is crucial also could be manipulated or denied or leaked. Now, threat 3, the potential for intrusion, surveillance, or sabotage, is a bit more tricky. And in the next panel after lunch, I'm going to take up the problem of cybersecurity and globalized supply chains. So I'm going to put that off, but on the table, we're going to take a close look at that. But the takeaway from this panel is, as Lindsay said, inward FDI offers extraordinary benefits to the whole economy. And what this three threats framework shows is that there are very few and can be rigorously identified instances that might pose a genuine national security threat.
Good morning, I guess it is still. And thank you, Fred, and to the Center for inviting me here today. I find that I'm probably going to end up throwing out most of my comments after both the introduction and listening to the other panels. And to give the normal Washington disclaimer, I'm only speaking for myself and not any of the associations, entities that I work with. I first want to talk about, Ted, just the Lenovo issue, because I think there are some facts relating to that transaction which bear a little more scrutiny. As you, I'm sure, know, some of the major questions about the Lenovo transaction at the time related to the fact that IBM PCs had penetrated were purchased substantially by U.S. government entities. So in addition to the questions about their encryption technology, the battery technology, both of which were excised from the deal ultimately, a good amount of the questioning was, how will those platforms be serviced subsequent to the transaction, because they were in the U.S. government hands. As Lenovo, shortly after its purchase of IBM, changed where its automatic patches, and I'm sure everyone at home probably has their auto patch on their computer turned on. Shortly after they took over IBM, they moved the patching from Armonk, New York to Shanghai, and that concerned a number of U.S. government entities. So the three threats tests that you want to apply, which I think in many ways our CFIUS participants are already doing internally, cannot be done simplistically. There are many things that have to be applied, and I think, quite frankly, they do a fairly good job. As I recall from last year's report, over the 2009-2011 period, the last period covered by their report, not one transaction went to the president for denial. So CFIUS may appear to be a barrier, but I think it's actually a pretty good way of taking many of the decisions out of the political framework. Not that politics isn't done on the side, but that they've been doing a pretty good job. Separately, coming from a labor background as well, let me also say that foreign direct investment overall is actually a very good thing. If you look at some of the largest employers in the United States, they hire people at good wages. Many of them have unions, etc. That does not mean that they're all good. One can go through the data firm by firm, but I don't think the debate today is about whether or not we have foreign investment. It's a question of what rules might be applied around certain instances. And let me turn, as a result of that, although I have a lot of comments on the other areas, to the U.S.-China situation, because I think that's the one that is causing the most unrest here in Washington, the most concern at the local levels, etc. And if there's time later, I think it's actually worth talking about the recent Scheinway-Smithfield transaction and why that merited scrutiny from our government. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, China is now operating under its 12th five-year plan. It has direction as it relates to how it wants its companies to operate. It has a sponsored go-out strategy urging them to go out and invest around the world. And for any transaction over $50 million, there has to be at least one and up to three and sometimes more governmental approvals. So this is part of some government network sponsorship. What is good for the country? What is good for China? What's good for their employment situation, etc. Last year, as many of you know, Sinopec announced a transaction in Wyoming, a $2.1 billion energy transaction. As part of the transaction, the officials indicated this is meant to help employment and production at home in China, not necessarily here. China's early transactions, investments, as we know, have primarily been in the natural resource field. Now that they have gone out and gotten probably the easy early pickings, they're now looking at trying to build international brands, since they have few of them, as well as gain technology, access to markets, etc. So the question is, what should we be doing? Again, many of the entities that are Chinese entities that are investing in the United States are SOEs, SIEs, or have some other form of state support. Indeed, the recent Scheinway transaction had a substantial amount of capital provided by a state-owned bank, and we are yet to know exactly what the terms of those loans are. We are, just moving forward, I'm also a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and the name of the commission was changed a number of years ago from the National Security Commission to Economic and National Security. So as it relates to how policymakers view national security, they view economic security as being inextricably intertwined in that definition. That, of course, gives you a slippery slope of issues and makes it more difficult. Last year, the China Commission, which is made up of 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, we had a unanimous report, suggested to Congress that, number one, Congress examine foreign direct investment from China to the U.S. and assess whether there is a need to amend the underlying statute, CFIUS, to 1, require a mandatory review of all controlling transactions by Chinese state-owned and state-controlled companies investing in the United States. Number 2, add a net economic benefit test to the existing national security test that CFIUS administers. And 3, prohibit investment in the U.S. industry by a foreign company whose government prohibits foreign investments in the same industry, so a reciprocity test. As we know, Congress has not yet taken up those recommendations, but as we look at what will be a wave of Chinese investment, Shine Wave being the most recent, and we can expect a fairly large wave coming to us, we need to have a better debate here, a better understanding of the data as to how we look at this situation. The question of how BEA looks at it, which, as I recall, had somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million worth of transactions for the previous year versus, well, I'll pull those up, but then we had, in a report to Congress, let me find this here since I had a look there, that we had, excuse me for 1 second, can't find it now, that the Rhodium Group's data, the data from many other entities is widely divergent when it comes to the question of what China's in fact doing in our economy, what they're doing through BVI, what they're doing through the Cayman Islands or any other of a number of host countries for their investments. There is a real need, as this today shows, for a deep and determined debate about what is the impact of these investments and what some of the policy responses should be. And with that, I'll look forward to some questions.
Raised an alternative model to Ted's 3 threats. He suggested the U.S. ought to have a national economic interest test and ought to have a reciprocity test in approving inward investments, at least from China. Ted, what do you say to that alternative proposal?
Well, you didn't say just from China, did you?
My comments are primarily China, but no, I think it's through all, CFIUS has to be broader, yes.
I am against both of those, but I will say mildly. I've actually looked quite closely at how the Canadian CFIUS process, and they do have a net economic benefits test, and it hasn't worked badly. So I could see that. The reason why I'm mildly against it is just getting the political process involved in, you know, trying to say, oh, you're not allowed to lay people off, or you know, and frankly, as an economist, often with mergers and acquisitions, not just foreign mergers and acquisitions, you want some restructuring. And people do get laid off, and, you know, it's kind of Schumpeterian reorganization. So I mildly say I'd rather keep both the federal process and the state process out of trying to say, well, is this good enough? But I don't think I would fall on my sword about that. Reciprocity, actually, I feel more strongly about. I mean, you're then going in the direction of really kind of micromanaging. Every country can invest. I mean, some countries can, some countries can't. If the country changes its legislation, what would you do? Would you grandfather? It just seems to me that that's going to get too complicated. But again, I understand the principle of reciprocity. I mean, that's how we do trade policy. So I'm not saying it's a terrible idea, but I don't think I would endorse it.
Let me, Fred, just quickly, only because one of the policy issues we didn't talk about today and we know is going to be on the horizon or already here is the bilateral investment treaty negotiations with China. And one of the issues, which is really where the reciprocity issue comes in, is the severe limitations U.S. and other firms have in investing in China, 49% or less. And rather than simply cementing in place the current equation that we have and providing guarantees under the current rules, I think there needs to be much more done to try and make sure there's reciprocity.
Okay, let me open up to the floor for questions and comments on any of this. Herbjorn Hansen, who's a member of the Institute's Board of Directors. Delighted to see you here.
Thank you, Fred. I'm coming from the other side of the ocean, and I would like to, from Europe and Norway.
The Atlantic Ocean.
Yes, the Atlantic Ocean. And I will comment upon the notion of reciprocity. And I would like to ask you on the panel, according to press reports, America has knowledge of all emails all over Europe. And if I understand this correctly, there is presently a rift between Germany and America in that regard. And how does this impact this whole stage? I'm all for investment in other countries, that countries invest in each other's activities. And of course, if we are very paranoid, you know, we can see the dangerous man all over the place. Let me give you an example. In Norway, we have one of the largest oil sectors in the world. If the government had not put down the foot in the late 60s, early 70s, the oil sector in Norway would have been taken over by American companies, no question. And now we have translated that oil sector into the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. Thank you.
Ted, do you want to answer this now? We're going to talk about cybersecurity during the third panel after lunch. But Ted, I leave it up to you. Do you want to say a word now or wait for that?
The day ends at 2 o'clock. At 2:10, I will offer a 7-point plan to reform the National Security Agency, but I think I'll leave that until after the...
That's a fair point. Other questions? Yes, in the back. Please go to the mic and introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks so much. Will Malden with the Wall Street Journal. And the China issue in terms of foreign direct investment seems to be frightening a lot of people politically and ordinary people and even economists. What makes China so different? Is it only the economic resurgence in our time? I mean, I'm scarcely able to remember when Japan was having some of these same issues before, so maybe you guys could just put it in a little context for us. Thanks.
Lindsay and or Ted?
Yeah, so I mean, there are concerns obviously with the national security, but a lot of people have economic concerns about China as well, and a lot of that stems from concerns about anything from environmental, labor standards, product quality, these sorts of things. But from that regard, I think one of the misperceptions, and we talk about this a little bit in our book, but I didn't get to it today, is the idea of firms that are located in the U.S. are subject to U.S. law and U.S. policy, which is in most cases much stricter than in China in terms of health standards, labor standards, environmental standards, and that this is actually a draw for a lot of these firms in China, the ability to get the Made in the USA stamp on their products. And so I think a lot of these concerns, I mean, certainly there are legitimate concerns, and Ted has talked a lot about those from the security standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, I'll use the Shanghai Smithfield deal as an example, that there are concerns. This is meat packing, this is an area that, you know, raises a lot of health and safety concerns in the U.S., but as long as they're located within the U.S., they're under U.S. regulatory control and subject to U.S. regulatory standards. And moreover, with that deal, to touch on a point that was mentioned earlier, the U.S. trade deficit, part of the stated purpose by Shanghai with that acquisition would be to export particularly pork products back to China, which, you know, is good for China in terms of, you know, increasing the supply of these products, increasing the product quality, product safety, but also good for the U.S. In terms of increasing U.S. It's a Chinese-owned firm, but it's exports from the U.S. to China. So from an economic perspective, I think, you know, there's a lot of fears that are sort of based on the economic situation in China that are misplaced when you're talking about these firms being located within the U.S.
Fred, if I could just on the Shineway, and there's actually another issue regarding the legal framework here. And I agree that the question about being having to abide by U.S. laws as it relates to food safety, all of that is true. Although, as we've seen from the GAO report recently, there's questions about confidence in our food safety laws, but they'll be applied to them as well. Part of the question for me about Shineway, and having spent time in Iowa earlier this year as it relates to pork farmers, is they've been trying to export pork to China for years. There has been some that's been allowed in recently, but not on a sustained basis. Concerns about ractopamine as well as a number of other things. Rather than opening the market to U.S. pork producers generally, the approach is let us buy the largest producer. Now the question for me, which is, you know, we will have to see over the coming days, is will any other U.S. producers be able to get into the market? Since Shineway does not have the same investor pressures that Hormel, Tyson, or whatever else, and I think Tyson's actually family owned, but some of the other companies here, will they be under the same pressures to earn a profit, or will you see price suppression throughout the food chain, no pun intended? So that for other pork farmers who may supply to Smithfield or others, are they going to find profits reduced? Are you going to find feed store owners, et cetera, having the same problem? So I think because China operates differently, is not a market economy, one has to also look, and we need a lot of data on this over time, about what the implications are going to be. Number two, quickly, the CFIUS applies to acquisitions of U.S. companies, but not greenfield investments. So if an SOE, Chinese SOE, invests in the U.S. with, let's say, no cost of capital because of non-performing loans, let's say they build a furnace at $600 million, and then they compete against another U.S. existing entity, there is no recourse under U.S. law for the anti-competitive impact of those of the free capital. If it was a product traded across a border, you could use AD/CVD, but our current competition statutes don't allow for any recourse against that impact because competition law is also based on the theory of recoupment. So one of the things we have been working on is, in addition to our competition laws, to assure that there will be a commercial basis in private rights of action if, in fact, you see the anti-competitive impact. But again, this goes to the complexity of the Chinese situation facing us, which is different than we've faced over many years.
So, Mike, just to be clear, is your preferred response, assuming what you said is right on the facts, is your preferred response an amendment of U.S. antitrust law or a restriction of the inward investment?
Having a U.S. private right of action. Again, there are jobs being created by much of this, but if we find that there are damage to our competitive situation, there should be an ability to seek redress. There is none under U.S. law right now.
Sounds like antitrust law.
Yes. In addition, Sherman, Clayton, Lanham, none of the current provisions apply.
Okay. Claude.
Claude Barfield, I guess first, Ted, I wish you'd be willing to fall on your sword and bleed a little more about the reciprocity and also the national economic test, because the discussion we've just had is would be a precursor of exactly what would happen if you opened to a national interest test or a national economic test. My question, though,
Speak into the mic, Claude.
my question, though, is there's also been, in addition to greenfield, to new investment, there's also been pressure in the Congress to expand CFIUS to cover all contracts, joint ventures, things of that nature, virtually all economic transactions. What's your reaction to that? Talk to Ted now.
Yep, Ted.
Claude, this is a setup for you to answer. I mean, yes, getting CFIUS has a narrow mandate, and I agree with you. It's become quite professionalized and immune from politics. I think this is an invitation to go in the other direction and reviewing all contracts, joint ventures, purchase agreements, and then having U.S. government officials kind of dictate what you can and can't buy is a mess. I'm not denying there may be some cases of genuine national security importance, but I think this is going to open the doors so broadly that it's just going to become unmanageable.
We've come to the end of our time, but I cannot resist concluding with a personal anecdote. For my sins, I was the first chairman of the CFIUS. Now, this is before it was ever statutory. This was in the late 1970s when I was Undersecretary at the Treasury, and the CFIUS had been created by executive order in the wake of fears that the Arabs would take over America. You may remember the period of the oil shocks and all that. In my 4 years as chairman of the CFIUS, I had one case, and it was a French case, Jean-Francois. It was when Renault took over American Motors. And American Motors made tanks and things like that that the military had to have. So that seemed like a pretty serious case. So we went to the French government and said, we want a firm, solemn declaration from you that American Motors will continue to operate as a commercial entity with no involvement or deflection by broader purposes of the French government. The ambassador duly signed such a note. He was put on notice if they violated, the transaction would be undone. It was carried out faithfully ever after, and the system worked. That was kind of a simplistic precedent to the Dubai Ports World case, where a similar commitment, but much more elaborate, was gotten from the government of the UAE. But it did indicate how a system can work if it doesn't get too complicated. Let me thank the speakers on the panel. We will adjourn now for a quick but hopefully tasty lunch. Please get your food, bring it back to the table. We'll resume at about 12:30, 12:35. Mark Nolan will be in the chair, and we'll try to pull all this together and hopefully as well have some more time for audience participation. But thanks to the speakers. Lindsay again, double duty. Ted helping oversee this whole thing. And Mike, very important perspectives. Thank you all.